Revelation 13. Where would you begin when you start studying the Revelation 13? Where would you start? What would you need to prepare the people to understand before they study this chapter? Well, perhaps a lot of things. Because we're talking now about the center point. We're leading up to the judgment of Revelation 14. And now we're showing that there's going to be a test of some kind for all the earth. So what possible places would you begin or want to have studied before you study Revelation 13? What do we see in Revelation 13 primarily? We have something called what?
We would have to study Daniel 7 first.
Yes. Why would we have to study Daniel 7 first?
Because we see the papal power, which is Rome, in Daniel 7, and then it's expanded upon in Revelation 13.
So right from Daniel chapter 7, we find all of the emblems, the symbols, and so forth explained already in Daniel chapter 7. Have you ever noticed that chapter 13 begins with an interesting reference to chapter 7? Let's look at it. Revelation 13, verse 2. Let's read verses 1 and 2 as we begin here. Now, we have the syllabus here we're going to be studying in a moment, but I want to give you an introduction a little bit, what we need to have prepared the people before we study Revelation 13. Now, it's not always the case that you can prepare people. I had an experience one time where I knew, the Lord told me I was going to only have one time to speak with this man. And he was going off to seminary school, and I gave him Revelation 13 first study. Last study as well. The only time I had. So the Lord gave me the opportunity, and I took it. And he was asking me, why are you telling me all this? I said, because God's told me this is the last time I will ever see you. And you need to know this. And it wasn't the last time I saw him, it was the last time we had any conversation. So who will read this? Would you like to read it, Damaris?
And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and a great authority.
Okay, we see something very interesting here in this text, that we see some elements that we met first in which chapter we already mentioned? Daniel chapter 7. And what is the order that we see these beasts appear? The leopard, the bear, and the lion. Now, is that the same order we saw in the book of Daniel?
No.
Why is it different, and what is different about it?
Well, it's different because, as you explained to us before, in Daniel he's starting at kind of the beginning and looking to the future, whereas John's looking back at the kingdoms that have already come and been conquered.
There's a very important principle there we need to remember when we're studying Bible prophecy, and that's a principle which I call the prophetic perspective. So as Daniel was presenting it, he was presenting it going forward. What is John presenting it as? Going backwards. From where he was looking backwards. If you're looking backwards, what would he first see from where he was? Well, Rome was there as the dragon, and he leaves it now because it's present tense at the end. But the first he would see Greece. The second he would see Medo-Persia. And looking backwards, he would see Babylon. I wonder that when we get to heaven, this is a very interesting thing. If you could travel faster than the speed of light, and you could go away from Earth 6,000 years, 6,000 light years away from Earth, which is not very far, by the way. Not very far at all. The universe is huge. The Milky Way is 120,000 light years across. Can you get your head around that? 120,000 light years across. Right? And the nearest star is something like 2.6 light years away. And Actually, Orion is 1,500 light years away, and it's in the same arm of the Milky Way, and that is only 1.5%, or a little more than 1% across the Milky Way is where Orion is. Excuse me. Maybe I should ask the controller to turn the sound off while I finish clearing my throat. So, 6,000 years would only be 4 times as far away as Orion is, which is not very far, which is only like, let's say, 5% across the universe, across the Milky Way. So now, if you could go out there 6,000 years away from Earth and travel back to Earth and have the ability to have like an instant replay of what went on Earth, how would you see the activity of Earth? You would see it in reverse, wouldn't you? You would see it in reverse. So what if, well actually, if you went 6,000 years away from Earth, you wouldn't see it in reverse so much. You would see Adam being created, wouldn't you? The light from Adam's creation is spreading out through the universe, what God did, at the speed of light. And if you went out 6,000 years, you would actually see what was happening on Earth, wouldn't you? If you could actually have that kind of vision. Now, can you imagine, let's say we were in the city of God, and we were traveling toward Earth, and we take 8 days to get there, but we take 1,000 years to come back. What would we be able to see? We would be able to see instant replay of everything that happened on Earth. It would be 6 times faster than it actually happened, but we could see everything. Wouldn't that be interesting? I mean, we have the concept of understanding that today because of our modern technology. We don't know how God is going to reveal all those things, but we know that He is. The point here is, what do we need to study with the people before we study Revelation? Revelation 13. And we see that there's a direct reference to Daniel chapter 7. What else is in this book, in this chapter? Don't we have an image to the beast here? What 2 parts do we have to this chapter? We have the beast, and we have the image to the beast. So where do we find a reference to that in the book of Daniel, particularly? What about chapter 3? Isn't the same test that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had in chapter 3 going to be the same test that God's people had? Are going to have? What about Ezekiel chapter 9? What's in Ezekiel chapter 9? The man with the writer's inkhorn, who put a mark upon all those that sigh and cry for the abominations done in Jerusalem. And if you go into chapter 8 of Ezekiel, there are 4 abominations mentioned there. And it's very interesting that the last abomination is what? What is the last abomination in Ezekiel chapter 8? Do you remember? Anybody remember? Well, let's go there and look at it. The last abomination in Ezekiel 8. What do we see in Revelations 4 and 5? What particular vision or scene did we see in Revelation 4 and 5? Well, we saw the throne of God. Where else do you see the throne of God? Daniel. Where else?
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, what chapters? 1 and 10, particularly. Where do we see it in Isaiah? Chapter 6. We see the throne of God. Now, what is different about the throne of God in the Old Testament as in the New Testament? What do we see particularly that's different? I'm not talking about the words they used. I'm talking about the actual things they saw.
24 elders.
The 24 elders are different. So there are no men saved from earth in the views of the vision in the Old Testament. Only in the New Testament, when we see the throne of God, do we see the 24 elders. So there is a difference between the two, but the scenes are described by different people in different times using different languages and even different attitudes and so forth. But now we see in Ezekiel chapter 8, the 4th abomination. We see in chapter 15 a greater abomination than these. So that's the 3rd abomination. And he brought me into the inner court of the house of God, and behold, the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of God, and their faces toward the east, and they worship the sun toward the east. Does that have any implication for us? Is that an interesting statement? Worshiping the sun? So the creation rather than the creator. So we here have an indication in Ezekiel about Sunday worship, and that's the fourth abomination, the greatest abomination. Perhaps we can talk about Ezekiel chapter 8 and what these abominations are at some other time. Maybe you can study that on your own and come up with your own ideas about it. But it's symbolic of the time of the end, and verses 1 through 5 of chapter 9 talk about the great sealing, the mark that's placed upon those who are serving the Lord and are concerned about what's happening among the people of God, the professed people of God. So now we come to chapter 13 of Revelation, and we're going to look at it in verse by verse. And this chapter, as we read in our notes here, what does it say? Who will read that for us? What's on the screen? This chapter shows what? How about Adrian? Would you read it for us?
Chapter shows us the relationship between the two great powers that will cooperate in the last great battle against God's people, papal Rome and the false prophet, apostate Protestantism.
Okay, so this chapter deals with the confederacy that will be created and allied against God's people. So we have some symbols here. It came up out of the sea. What does this mean? We read in Revelation 15 or 17 verse 15, we know that this represents the people. And a beast. What is a beast in Bible prophecy?
Kingdom.
Okay, a kingdom, particularly what kind of kingdom?
A geopolitical power.
Geopolitical, we could say religious as well. Religious political power. A beast is a religious political power, has civil authority, and also makes special requirements as far as beliefs and religion is concerned. So what is this composite beast composed of? Adrian, would you help us again? As we've already said, we were pointed to Daniel chapter 7.
A composite beast. The four characteristics of the animal seen by the prophet Daniel are here reflected. It culminates in the fourth and last power, the dragon. Rome received its power from Satan and in its papal form now enters the scene. Note that John mentions the four beasts of Daniel in reverse order as he looks back from his day. He lived under the last power. Rome received satanic power, the seed of Satan.
So see notes on Revelation 2, 9,
Yeah.
and 13, actually. That should say 13 there, so that should be a closed parentheses. And his authority. Okay, verse 3, one of his heads. Mark, could I ask you to read this one?
Verse 3.
Verse 3, it says, verse 3, one of his heads. What does that mean?
You will remember the seven forms of Roman government, of which the Pope is the seventh. This head was now wounded, which happened through Napoleon's action in sending General Berthier to capture the ruling Pope in Rome and bring him to France to die in captivity at Valence, August 29, 1790.
Okay, so we see one of his heads were wounded as were death. What is this called? Later in the chapter, what is this called? The deadly wound. And this deadly wound is going to be healed. We read the wound was healed. Read on, Mark.
Wound was healed. Although deadly, the wound was healed. This was fulfilled in the restoration of Vatican State as a nation among the nations, having full ambassadorial and diplomatic privilege. In 1929, Mussolini, the Italian dictator, signed the late Lateran Treaty, bringing about these things.
Okay? So we have here now what has been stated, even in the news at the time, the deadly wound was healed. This is what one newspaper quoted when this happened, the Lateran Treaty. It's also called the Lateran Pact. Now, some interesting things about the Vatican history that we usually don't hear or talk about. We cannot say that the Pope and the Lateran and everything was fully disarmed in 1798. What happened shortly after that, they elected another Pope, and they still existed to go on as a political power. And the issue that I want to mention here, this is a kind of a picture of Vatican State. So this is a section, a picture of the Vatican State as it is today. It has its own army, post office, banks, railroads, ambassadors, and the Pope is also, you might say, kind of a king today. But what actually happened is a little more detailed than we usually talk about, because the Pope and its ambassadorage and so forth continued for some time. Actually, the deadly wound, as far as Vatican State is concerned, was not completely finished until 1870. It tells us that the Lateran Treaty was accomplished and signed on February 11th, 1929. Well, the population of the Vatican is just over 800. It's smallest sovereign state in the world. Its current boundaries, established in 1929 by the Lateran Treaty, more commonly known as the Lateran Pact. The pact was signed into law on February 11, 1929 by Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Giuseppe on behalf of the Holy See. Notice how Holy See is spelled. And by Prime Minister Benito Mussolini on behalf of the nation of Italy. The original papal states, however, which extended from 756 to 1870, had encompassed much of central Italy. But this territory was absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy in 1870, almost 60 years later, with much diminished Vatican State was recreated. So Vatican State actually was non-existent from 1870 to 1929, when the Lateran Treaty was signed. This stipulation, however, under the Lateran Treaty, the Vatican could exist on condition that the Vatican would respect Italian law. And this is 1929 Lateran Treaty. Did you hear me? That's a very important point. The Lateran Treaty states that the Vatican could exist in 1929 on the basis that it would respect Italian law. And you can look up this treaty and you can read that. On January 10th, 1984, actually the United States decided, I believe it was May 13, 1981, it was either May 1 or May 13, 1981, that the United States agreed to send an ambassador to Rome. You see, in 1870, the United States had a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. And so the Congress passed a law that the United States would no longer have diplomatic relationships with the Vatican. When did that occur? 1870. So the Vatican was cut off from diplomatic relationship with the United States in 1870. In 1929, it was reestablished. That the Vatican State was reestablished. Well, I'm not giving a whole picture, but what we're trying to say here is that not only was Italy against Rome, but the United States was also down on Rome. So Italy dissolved the Vatican and took away all its territory. So the Vatican ceased to exist in 1870. And about this time also, a year earlier maybe, or a few years later, the United States, I didn't put the date here, dissolved relationships with Italy based upon its anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. So it says here that the United States government had diplomatic consular relationship with the papacy and the papal state from 1797 to 1870. But on January 10th, the time, there was no official, for that time between 1870 and 1984, there was no diplomatic relationships between the United States and Vatican until Ronald Reagan established full diplomatic relationship with the Vatican when he appointed William A. Wilson as ambassador in 1984. 1981 was when the United States agreed to have relationships, and I believe it was May 13th. And it's very interesting for me that it was actually, I think, in May 13th, 1871, exactly 110 years before, that there was some kind of legal action taken against the papacy also in the United States. I don't know exactly where that was. I read it once and I've tried to find it again, but I haven't been able to find it. It was very interesting and I forgot to keep the record of it. May 13th, 1871, May 13th, 1981. Okay, we go on. Now, in December of 2008, the Vatican divorces from Italian law. And this is from the BBC News report of January 2, 2009. Vatican City State, the world's smallest sovereign state, I'm quoting now from the BBC News, has decided to divorce itself from Italian law. This headline was the result of the Vatican's announcement in December of 2008 that it was free from unequivocally respecting Italian law. And the reason they did this, of course, was because of things like homosexuality, liberalizing other kinds of family relationships such as marriage laws, marriage between homosexuals and so forth, which the church, the Catholic Church cannot rightly, I would say, approve. So they say now some legal observers believe that the Vatican is simply trying to assert its legal independence in cases involving, for example, civil unions, divorce, living wills, or euthanasia. Henceforth, we're quoting again from the BBC News, all Italian law will now be examined one by one before they are adopted. So with this press release, the Vatican placed itself not below, but above the state. So we can say now that the power, seat, and great authority have been established. As of when? Fully. 2008, beginning 2009. It can safely be said that in 1929 the Vatican received again power. In 1984 it received seat. And in 2008, 2009 it assumed great authority. Very interesting. What do we read in Revelation? Power, seat, and great authority. So after 210 years, the deadly wound is fully healed. 1798 to 99 to 2008, 2009. Do you find this interesting?
Yes.
I find it very interesting and very current. That we're living in that time when that deadly wound is healed. What does that mean according to what we're going to read in Revelation 13? That we are living in that time when these things are about to happen. So we have here all that dwell upon the earth. Well, let's read now a little bit more of Revelation. We need to read Revelation 13, verse 3. Who's going to read that for us? Danny, do you have it? Read it for us.
13 verse 3 says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast."
So all the world wondered after the beast. I read in a Catholic commentary one time that it says the beast of Revelation 13, the first beast of Revelation 13, is the Antichrist because it receives a deadly wound and lives. So it's the Antichrist. They recognize Revelation 13 as pointing to the Antichrist. Very interesting. Why? Because it receives a deadly wound and lives. When the Pope was shot, remember he almost died, Pope John Paul? What about Ronald Reagan? Wasn't he also shot the same year and barely missed dying? Very interesting that these two men, Reagan, who reestablished diplomatic relationship with the papacy, and Pope John Paul themselves, also received deadly wounds, and they lived. And this was about 1981, 1984, in that period when they were to be established. If you go back in American history, you will find that every president that was elected on a year divisible by 20 was assassinated or died in office. Until Ronald Reagan. He was assassinated, should have died, but lived. He was the 8th. Interesting. I wonder if there's something to that. He broke the curse, the spell, was placed in America. So power, seat, and great authority were established finally in 2008, 2009, and all that dwell on the earth are going to worship this beast. This prediction that all will worship this power is still in the future. That's Great Controversy 590, 579. Who would like to read that for us? Richard, would you read it, please? Since the middle.
Sorry, where are we?
The bottom of the page.
Okay.
Since,
Verse 4.
since the middle. You see my arrow
Yes,
right
yes,
there?
yes.
All right.
Since the middle of the 19th century, students of prophecy in the United States have presented this testimony to the world. In the events now taking place is seen a rapid advance toward the fulfillment of the prediction.
All right, let's read verse 4. There's another element brought in here in verse 4, and it's about the dragon. So, who will read verse 4? Leo, do you have verse 4? Verse 4.
And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?
This is a very interesting quote. Who is able to make war with him? How can you make war with a power that doesn't have an army? How can you make war with a power that uses other armies to defend itself? It's kind of hard to make a war with the Vatican.
There was, I believe that just a little further up in the notes it mentioned that the Vatican does actually have an army, but it's a very small and insignificant army. I'm sure.
It's merely security force for within the Vatican itself.
Oh,
Okay, it's like a hired security force, and remember there's only like 800 residents there. I don't know if some of these people who are hired for security, local security, are on the grounds or not. But it's more like a standing police guard. They do have, ceremonies and so forth, but it's certainly not a battalion or even a company, probably a company of people who take care of security. Right, so we see here that all the world is going to worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Worshipping the beast is identical with worshiping the dragon, it says, who gave the beast its power. Now, who's the dragon? Where do we see the dragon? What chapter do we see the dragon in? 12. What is the particular nature of the dragon? How did we describe the dragon? Okay, we have there the dragon, and we see also a similar beast in Daniel. But the dragon is what we would term as paganism or heathenism. We find that the beast is Catholicism, and that the false prophet is false Protestantism. So now we have these three powers which make up what? What makes up Babylon? These three powers. The beast, the dragon first, the beast, and the false prophet. These make up Babylon. What is particularly interesting about beast religion? We studied this in some weeks ago. What is particularly interesting about heathenism? How do we approach God in heathenism? With fear?
But you approach God as you feel like you yourself are a God, that you're in the place of God.
That's atheism.
Oh.
Okay? But in...
So then you approach God that he's everywhere, he's in everything.
That's pantheism, that he's everywhere. But particularly in heathenism, we approach God in a way to appease him, to buy him.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's a work-centered religion. And do we see that in many of the different religions around the world where we have to go on pilgrimages, we have to make offerings, we have to pay whatever it takes to get the rain to fall or whatever it might be. We have specific things we need to do to appease an angry God. This is heathenism. Can we say that Judaism falls under the category of heathenism? As it is perverted, yes, because why? They look at the temple sacrifices and everything as a means of salvation, not as a means or language of repentance, confession, and service and worship to God. So dragon religion relates to this kind of worship. But the beast has a different kind of religion. What is the religion of the beast? What did we read in Faith and Works that I quoted you in that other study? Do you remember? Okay, beast religion then is faith and works. That we can have a relationship with God through faith and works. And of course we have the religion of the false prophet, which is presumption. Faith in your faith, basically. So reading this, the worship of the dragon, worshiping the beast is identical with worshiping the dragon. This also denotes a revival of spiritualism. When did spiritualism come into the picture? Do you know? 1848 was the rise of spiritualism. The knocking on the wall in Maine, I believe it was. So while God had brought up the Advent movement in this area of the world, also in the same place we have now communications with supposedly the dead. Spiritualism arose at this time. Also did the Pentecostal movement, came along also at the same time with some of the same trappings. This has flourished also under Catholic influence. Pentecostalism is also readily part of Catholic worship today, and also in many Protestant movements as well. So Satan works with all deceivableness and unrighteousness, it tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10. The devil aims that through Rome, Catholicism, spiritualism, and apostate Protestantism, the world shall worship him, except for the remnant he will succeed. Now can you give me a verse that talks about this in the later chapters of the book of Revelation? Let's look at Revelation 16, verse 13, please. Revelation 16, verse 13. So spiritualism is what is behind the movement of bringing together the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And it says there, and I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. So we see here that spiritualism is the combining glue that brings these 3 powers together. We have Pentecostalism among Protestantism. We have also this the same movement among Catholicisms. Behind Catholicism, we have a lot of Pentecostal things happening. What do we see in the world? What do we see in the world today? Do we see a rise of spiritualism in the world today? And how fast has it risen, particularly in the last 15 or so years? Can you give me an example of this? What about Harry Potter series? What about games, video games? What about 50 years ago, they had a lot of cartoons about Casper the Ghost. Well, the Lord of the Rings. It happened even 10 years ago. But now it's a big thing. So we're seeing a lot of implications that are happening today. Now, I haven't seen any of these movies, but I've heard about them. And so we see that people are playing with things that they had never played with before. Have you heard of Ouija boards? Yeah, Nintendo. These are spiritually derived and influenced games. And if you're playing these games, you're playing with spiritualism. Yeah, that's true. And we think nothing of it, and kids do it all the time. It's a very common thing today. So we have a great rise in spiritualism, and this spiritualism is going to do what? It's going to combine the whole world except those who serve God. Now let's read verse 5. Do you have it, Adrian? Verse 5.
And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months.
Okay, what do we see here in this verse that we can relate again to Daniel chapter 7? What is the 40 and 2 months? How long is that?
1,260 years.
1,260 days or years. We see that also in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. What do we see in that? Blasphemy. What is the blasphemy spoken of here?
Putting themselves in the place of God.
2, forgive sins. The beast was to continue 42 months. The little horn had continued that time. And we see also from the beginning of the rise of the papacy to its fall. If you look at the beginning of the papacy, what happened in 1793? We studied that, didn't we? The French Revolution. So we have 7 years that, well, not quite 7, the 33, 533 to 538, that is what, 5 years or so? So we have 1793 to 1798 also. That 5 years was also that. It's a similar period of 1,260 years, parallel. Let's go on. And prevail against them. So this horn made war with the saints and for this period of time, but we're going to read also that he had some time limited. So now let's read verse 6 about blasphemy. Leo, could you read that, please? And
he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven.
all right, so our notes say the Pope does this daily by assuming every title given to Christ. Not only does he assume the rights of Christ himself, but also his tabernacle. This power sets up a temple on earth and thus draws people's attention away from the sanctuary in heaven. Did we talk about that at all? That point in our studies? Remember that in Daniel the daily is taken away and the abomination of desolation set up? So it's assumed and thought by some that what has been taken away is Christ's ministry in heaven and substituted by earthly ministry. What is the power of the Catholic Church? The power of the Catholic Church is in the priests. The priests hold sway over the people. How? Because they need to confess to the priest. He knows all the secrets about them. And what do they do in the Mass? They actually create God in the Eucharist. They tell you if you bite it, it's going to bleed. The Pope claiming to be God on earth and taking the titles of Christ on earth. The priesthood also is that which bonds the people to the church. It also has its own Savior, the church. It has its own sacrifice, the Mass. It has its own mediator, the clergy. Its own salvation, the sacrament. Its own justification, what?
Self-righteousness.
Self-righteousness. And it has its own forgiveness, confession. Okay? So we see here a very strong relationship between what the church is and has done as to what Christ wants to do. Now, let me ask you, what does Antichrist mean?
He's in place of.
It means in place of, not just against, but taking the place of. Do we see a replacement here in these things? So we have a counterfeit of the real. It says, and in heaven it has its own infallible, all-powerful advocate. Who is that?
For them it's
The Mother of God, Mary. So, have you ever heard a Catholic Mass? How many of you have heard of Catholic Mass? I'm sure that some of you have, because you've maybe had some relationships with people who have, or maybe you've even come out of the Catholic Church. I've never fully heard a Catholic Mass, but I've heard parts. I've stood outside the church and heard parts of a Catholic Mass. Very interesting. The repetition and the praise to Mary is very strong. Now let's read verses 7 and 8. Richard again, please.
Yes. The actual verses or the...
Read verses 7 and 8.
Okay. Let's switch to there, sorry. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life, of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
Okay, now we come to this, a very important text. And look at it from the point of view of its context. So this power was going to make war with the saints. Did we see that in chapter 12? What happened in chapter 12? Remember that the
the wearing out of the
The
sins.
woman had to flee into the
wilderness, and after the flood that was cast out after her, and she had to remain there for 1,260 years. So we find here that this power is described as a persecuting power. How does it put it in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25? Wear out the saints of the Most High. Here it says something very similar. Again, we have a relationship to that chapter. So it's given him to overcome them. But what does it say in the last part of Daniel chapter 7? But judgment was given in favor of the saints, it says. So even though this power was to persecute God's people, it was also, in the end, determined that God's people would have a proper hearing. What do we read also about the voice of persecution as far as like what happened to Abel and the saints of all times? What does it say in the book of Daniel about those people who were faithful? That they were overcome and possess the kingdom. Authority given to this power says authority over the nations, the people of the earth. All those who are not written in the book of life of the Lamb worship him. Now, when you think about your name in the book of life, what does it take to put your name in the book of life? But notice what it says here in this verse. Whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. When was your name written in the book of life?
When you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior.
Okay, when you accepted Jesus Christ. Can you prove that? Can you prove that statement? Well, in the book of life. So, when Christ died upon the cross of Calvary, he sealed the covenant he made with us, that he would redeem us. And that death occurred on the cross. Concerned, what did he that power that we need is sufficiently there in Jesus Christ. Though all those who are not written names are written in the book of life. Extremely important, isn't it? It's not what we know. It's not even our experience. It's not our intelligence. It's what's going to happen. You can know the prophecies. You can tell everybody who the Pope is. You can tell everybody and describe the Antichrist. You can define all the prophecies and know all these things. But if your name is not written in the book of life, you're going to worship the beast. That's what it says. Now, what does it take to have our names written in the book of life? Have any idea? Well, I believe it's the love of God must be in our hearts, and that comes by the Holy Spirit. And as we practice faith, as we seek to yield ourselves to the will of God and see his will in everything. We were talking yesterday about seeing God, weren't we? Remember? In our lives. Everything that's happening, we need to see God. Who's going to see God? The pure in heart. So if we're going to be those people who have faith in God and our trust is in him, we're going to see everything as God allowed. We're going to understand that he is the one who's guiding everything. He is the great designer, and nothing happens but what God allows. If we don't have that kind of faith and that kind of experience, can we say our names are for sure written? God, moment by moment. May the Lord help us that we can have this experience with him and see him working and seek to see him working in our lives, in everything. So we'll stop here and carry on the rest of our study after a short break. May the Lord help us, we pray.